Now, Martin, I've got a question for you. What was the most important news event of last week to listeners of this podcast?
Was it the grand finale of Taskmaster? I think everyone was following that pretty avidly. Certainly I was. I'm not really sure what else happened.
Not quite, Martin. I think that was maybe the second most important thing. I will concede the budget is the third most important thing, even though it did mention the Northern Powerhouse Rail project again, but without providing any details, as we've covered on the show before.
So what was the most important?
So last Monday, very annoyingly, just after we published last week's show, the Independent Nuclear Regulatory Taskforce dropped its final report, and it is, as the kids say, Martin, a total banger.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, it's between this and the new Jack Reacher for what I'm going to be reading this weekend. But what's so special? Sell it to me, James.
Okay, so a lot of people like to talk about nuclear winter, Martin, but this report really was, I think, nuclear Christmas.
Is that why Rudolph's nose is like so bright red because it's radioactive?
It must be something like that, Martin. So this report, it was written by John Fingleton, who's a very eminent economist. He's someone you instinctively sort of want to refer to as Sir John Fingleton, even though he's not got a knighthood just because he's written sort of a big government report. But anyway, what this was, it was the government went away and asked him to dive in to the British nuclear industry and basically work out how to make it better and work out why building nuclear is so slow and expensive, as we've talked about on this show time and time again for ages now. And basically, the reason it's exciting is because it's a really great report. It hits upon basically everything the sort of nuke enthusiasts like us have been complaining about for so long. And it basically just tells the government to do better. And now we've got this enormous, powerful document saying, just do this.
And so this is massively important, right? Because as we've talked about before, the future of abundant energy is probably renewables backed with nuclear, a kind of nuclear backbone. And we know the Hinkley Point C is going to cost, 48 billion. Sizewell C is probably not going to be very far behind that. And also these are projects that are taking years to complete. So they're not coming online until, sometime in the 2030s. Probably have HS2, before some of these are actually, steady on, Martin. That would be crazy. But like it basically at the moment, it's very slow. It's very expensive. And I guess the question is, how do we get out of that?
Yeah, the current situation is completely insane. And the report itself is pretty damning of Britain's current approach to nuclear. If, the confusing mess of sort of regulations and rules that we have now can be described as an approach, because that makes it sound too coherent. I mean, a really good example of this, and it's highlighted in the report, but I will mention it again. It's a bit of a cliche now to mention this in sort of YIMBY, pro-building, pro-nuclear circles, but it's such a good example of the sort of problem. It's what Michael Gove famously called the fish disco.
Right. So this was the fantastic feature at Hinkley Point C, I think in Somerset, which was basically they were worried about fish swimming into the water intakes of the nuclear power plant. They thought they might get exposed to some level of radiation, perhaps develop superpowers like telepathy or become really, really strong. And then they would storm the beaches and it would basically be like World War II all over again, but just with a much more aquatic theme. And so the acoustic sensors were essentially to try and avoid war by stopping it at the source, just deterring the fish from swimming into the plant by, I don't know, basically playing really bad music. A bit like when I try to go to a pub for a nice Sunday dinner and they're playing young people's music and, drowning out the conversation. Something like that is what I'm imagining, James.
It's exactly like that, Martin. It's a good example of, if something really is infuriating you, give it a stupid name so it sticks and becomes memorable. So I don't know if we've talked on the show about the fish disco before, but as half the people on my sort of Twitter and Blue Sky timelines use it as a reference point all of the time, I do want to briefly touch on it again because the report, it really reminds you of just how insane these sort of mitigation measures are. So Martin, we haven't done one of these in a while, but I'm going to make you guess something. This is the annoying thing. So inevitably you will guess this exactly spot on and infuriate me. But tell me, how much money do you think the following fish protection measures at Hinkley Point C are going to cost altogether? So there's three different systems. There's the low velocity side entry water intake. There's a fish recovery and return system, an FRR, and an acoustic fish deterrence. That's the fish disco. Have a guess. How much do you think of British taxpayers' money, or I guess the investors' money? The point is, someone's money, do you think is going on all this fish deterrent?
I mean, there's so much to unpack here, James, not least why all of these sound like names taken from a 1950s like comic book, like Batman, quick, fetch the acoustic fish deterrent. Get these sharks away from us. Who the hell comes up with these names? But this may be the first time, James, you've done this and it hasn't backfired, because I genuinely don't know. I'm going to guess, just because nothing costs less than this in nuclear terms, I'm going to guess a cool £10 million.
10 million, Martin. That's your final guess.
That's my final.
The actual answer for these 3 fish mitigation systems is, and I'm not making this up, this is in the report, you can go and download this now, £700 million!
What? That's like 6 bat tunnels.
Yeah, it's absurd. So the fish disco itself, that's 50 million quid.
Right.
The entry water intake heads or whatever it was, 500 million quid. But anyway,
yeah, for the fish disco, I'm sorry, how much of that 50 million is for like music rights? Just out of interest, like have Coldplay got like 10 million quid off of this? Like, this is the freedom of information request I really want to see.
This is why we should use AI music, because there's no royalties on that. It'd be fine.
Yeah,
That'd be much cheaper.
perfect.
That'd save a few quid. But anyway, no, the report itself, and it points it out. So what's crazy about this? So there's all these mitigations that have been put in. And the mad thing is that they did some modelling, or EDF did some modelling on this, and they reckoned it could save, on average, 0.083 salmon every year, along with 0.028 sea trout, 6 river lamprey, 8 Alice shad, as you can tell, I know nothing about fish, and 528 twait shad, or possibly fewer than 100 based on more recent estimates. So basically, there's 700 million quid being spent on this, and you're saving no fish. It's a classic example of all the stuff we talk about in this show just going a bit crazy and out of control.
I mean, once again, I'm pretty sure some of these names are made up. Like, what is a twait shad? It sounds like something young people are doing behind bushes or something. That's like, what?
I googled a picture of it, Martin, and to me it just looked like a fish. Average fish, but I don't know. Maybe they're special in some sort of way. But anyway, so the report describes the status quo, where we are, as a, quote, systematic regulatory failure. And it's pretty damning, because it actually says that the issue spans regulators, government and industry. It creates a cycle of inefficiency, delay and excessive cost. This is deeply rooted and embedded in the sector's culture. Interconnected failures feed on each other, acting as bottlenecks that prevent the effective delivery of critical nuclear projects.
So what do they reckon the root causes of this are? Like, what's the fundamental problem here?
So what the task force puts it down to is a whole bunch of things. So again, we've touched on various things over the months we've been doing this podcast. So there's fragmented oversight of all things nuclear. So there's several different regulators who have to weigh in whenever you try to build, like, say, a new nuclear power station. All the decisions making, or a lot of the decisions, are disproportionate. So regulators are sort of too conservative and too risk averse. So they'll make these costly decisions, like the disproportionate thing about the fish disco and stuff, because that's just seen as easier than saying, oh, we'll take a risk and maybe accidentally kill some fish or something like that. And then there's the underlying laws as well that are identified. So they prioritize process over outcome. That's something we see across, like, housing and everything else. Same again with nuclear. And then the government has also criticized itself. So I guess multiple governments now just being slow and indecisive. They don't seem to know what they actually want, which you'd hope a government would do, but apparently that's a problem. And then there's also the structure of the industry itself. So the report says that it's, quote, near monopolistic in some respects. And so that basically changes the incentives, because if you're the big incumbent who's doing all the nuclear building, then you, in a sense, you like all these cumbersome regulations and barriers, because it's barriers to stop anyone starting up and doing their own thing and being a competition to you. So you can just be the big fat incumbent sucking on the teat of the British taxpayer, as if you want a weirdly evocative image. So it's all the sort of things we moan about, basically. And this report says, yeah, no, these are massive problems.
And it's amazing how much of this comes back to risk in a way that really tweaks me and kind of relates to our previous item as well. But yeah, this is something that'll be a big theme in the spoiler alert book that I'm writing. We talk about it a lot on the podcast.
Just slide it in there, Martin. I think that's the first time you've mentioned it on the show.
Well, stay tuned for, 3 years and you might even see it. But people constantly talk about regulators as being like risk averse or conservative. I would argue they're actually not. They're completely the opposite. But like most people who claim to be risk averse and hate risk, actually they're just being incredibly selective about which risks they think about and care about and which they don't. So in the life sciences, for example, that's a really good area where there's actually quite strong and productive regulation, right? So regulators work with pharma companies on the basis that, of course, they want to reduce the risks associated with new medicines coming to market. Nobody wants a new painkiller that turns you purple or something, or a new asthma inhaler that makes your head explode. Like, obviously, we don't want those things to happen. But they also understand that there is another huge risk, which is that new medicines don't come to market, because all of these are things that could potentially save lives. So the regulators there understand that their job is to work with companies to actually achieve progress, to achieve that goal. They are part of the process of bringing new drugs to market and improving lives. But if you take regulators in areas like nuclear or planning, for that matter, it's like they can see one side of the risk. They can see the risk of any kind of change, but they're completely oblivious to the risk of, well, what if things stay as they are now? Or like, what if we don't have enough electricity? Or if people have a terrible standard of living because buying electricity costs too much money? Or, our industries don't have the power that they need. Or we have to buy gas in from Russia or the Middle East because we're not energy independent. What if houses in the planning sector cost £1 million each? So they completely ignore those risks. And so it's not that, in my opinion, that they're risk averse. It's that they're in complete denial of just one set of risks and just laser focused on like this tiny little pocket here that they obsess about.
I couldn't agree with you more, Martin, and that seems to be the case in the nuclear industry, especially. I mean, I'll give you one more quote from the report because it's a very, very brutal read, and this is all just from one short section. So John Fingleton says at some point, these issues have cultivated a deep ingrained culture of complacency and extreme risk aversion across the sector. This status quo mindset perpetuates the cycle of inefficiency and is a fundamental barrier to progress and delivery. So yeah, he's exactly agreeing with exactly what you just said.
Yeah, and again, to sort of hammer the point home, it's as if biotech regulators started out with the aim to stop new drugs from being released. And they took a view that any new drug is a threat to human health. So our default position is you can't release any drug if there's even the slightest side effect. And I think most people would regard that as a completely insane way to approach regulating a sector and basically impossible for innovators to deal with, which is what we're seeing here. And so the question, I guess, is how do we fix it, James? What are the suggestions?
Yeah, so the report has 47 recommendations in all, and don't worry, I'm not going to go through all of them. That's for our bonus podcast. The rest is nuclear regulations. But basically, it's all the stuff we've wanted for ages. So I'll quickly run through a few of them. So basically, the task force wants a single nuclear regulator. And I think this is a sort of amazingly ambitious idea. The idea is it's one regulator rather than, the 6 or 7 who might have to wade in. And that means they can set the safety rules and they can take charge of nuclear planning applications. So when they come in as nationally significant infrastructure projects, as they obviously are. And it could speed things up because then you'll get better alignment between what the rules say and who's judging whether the rules have been met. And that's better than having different institutions with different objectives fighting each other. And then there's basically a whole bunch of proposals in the report which also add up to a more sophisticated approach to risk, like we were just saying, and sort of proportionality. So one example of this is a change in the rules in where nuclear power stations can be sited. Because at the moment, the rules say, well, you've got to be a long way away from population centres, you've got to be near the coast. And apparently, modern reactors, everyone thinks now, are basically safe enough to not be this sort of paranoid, but the rules haven't been updated to sort of match that.
Yeah, and that's super important because, this is my ambition to have a smaller, a micro modular nuclear reactor in my attic. And this really feels like it's paving the way for that to happen. And then neighbors can't object now.
It did make me think, Martin, of the time that you made me walk through Dungeness. We went to see the power station there many years ago, and it turned into a bit of a death march across the dunes. I'm a very unfit man, Martin. It was a very long walk, because obviously the power plant was a very long way away. So anything to mitigate that, if we can just have a lovely city centre nuclear power station, that would be much more convenient for me. But I will carry on. So there's a whole other load of things in the report. So planning stuff. We talk about planning all the time on this show, and so the nuclear report, basically on the same page, they want to limit the scope of judicial reviews, which we've talked about before, slowing things down. I think we talked about it in the context of like Heathrow's third runway. So same thing here, limit the ability to judicial review stuff and get things happen faster. And then nature reviews as well. And this is basically echoing what's happening with the planning bill in that they want habitat regulation to change. So rather than, Sizewell having to mitigate the fish at Sizewell or Hinkley having to do it at Hinkley, they could instead maybe just pay into a central fund and we could do better nature mitigation projects somewhere else for cheaper, more sensibly, which might actually, help save a few more animals. And then there's my favourite recommendation, Martin, and that's because this is something we've also talked about, which is that the task force thinks we should take a more fleet-based approach to nuclear. Because at the moment, Sizewell C, Hinkley Point C, when you want to build a nuclear power plant in Britain, it's like a bespoke thing. It's like a master craftsman in his garage or his attic whittling a chair out of tree bark in a very bespoke way. Whereas if we can build nuclear reactors on basically a production line or copy and paste the same thing, then you can make it happen a lot faster. So he recommends doing things we've talked about before. So doing international harmonization around recognizing what other regulators do. So if France or South Korea, for example, say this reactor's safe, we should probably take their word for it because they're our friends and they've got sensible regulations as well. So there's no need for the paperwork to start from scratch. And then there's also if a reactor has been approved in one place, then, well, why not build the same thing somewhere else? It's not as if the safety parameters are going to change that much because the sort of atmosphere and other conditions or whatever else is probably quite similar in different parts of Britain. Rather than having to start from scratch, this is a whole new, completely uncharted territory.
I mean, I don't know, James. Trusting the French seems a bit rash after the last 700 years of history. But leaving that aside, the rest of it sounds great. But this is just a report by one man, however impressively named. Is any of it going to actually happen?
So I think this is the big question, and this brings us back to the budget. So in the budget, Rachel Reeves said this.
And today I'm pleased to welcome John Finkelton's report, an ambitious plan to cut the red tape that has tied our nuclear industry in knots for decades. And within 3 months, we will set out our plan for delivering his recommendations.
And then the day after she said that, Lord Patrick Vallance of COVID fame, he's now a science minister in the House of Lords, and he said this.
We welcome and endorse the report and accept the principle of the recommendations it has set out. We will present a full implementation plan within 3 months. The task force will be engaged in the implementation phase to review progress and support delivery. We will complete implementation within 2 years, subject to legislative timelines on elements requiring primary legislation. We've already met the first recommendation with the publication of the Prime Minister's strategic steer.
So I think listening to them, it certainly sounds positive, doesn't it? I mean, they're definitely enthusiastic, but I think there are still some questions. So, for example, why the 3 months delay? Why not just accept them now? Or at least do it a lot sooner? Because it's infuriating that everything takes so long. And then there's also a curious line from Patrick Vallance who says he accepts the principle of the recommendations, which maybe that's a full-throated endorsement of them, but it just sounds a bit to me like the sort of thing people say when they're not fully committed to the substance of the ideas. It's like my partner will tell me to do the washing up right this second because the sink's overflowing, and I will say to her, Liz, I accept the principle of doing the washing up, but I'm going to continue to sit on my arse for 3 months. It just seems maybe a bit like that if you're being a bit pessimistic.
It's sort of like the centrist approach to state ownership. I don't necessarily mind who washes up the plates, but I support clean plates, and I'm eager to explore all sorts of different avenues and opportunities that clean plates could happen at some time in the future.
And get this, Martin, I've actually got some hot Westminster gossip. I can't double source this, but I'm going to spread a rumour I've heard, because I've heard from someone who's pretty reliable, who says that the thinking inside government is apparently that I think 43 of the 47 recommendations are basically being accepted. But then there are some worries about how the remaining 4 recommendations could basically conflict with EU treaty obligations, so it's getting bogged down in sort of legal wrangling again.
Oh, no, I knew this would all come back to the French again.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what's causing the problems, but I consulted an expert I know in international law, ChatGPT, and it reckoned that the problems could be that either it's something to do with state aid or subsidies, or it could be something to do with what is called, and I'm going to almost certainly mispronounce this, called the Aarhus Convention, which isn't an EU thing. It's like an international treaty that the EU has signed up to, and it basically allows people to appeal against projects and things on an environmental basis. And though, again, the EU has adopted this, we have still de facto adopted this because we've signed a big treaty with the EU for trade and things. If we want that treaty to remain intact, we have to follow it as well. So it does appear there are some complications there, so I guess we'll wait and see. But I do think it's important for everyone listening to keep the pressure on the politicians and say we do want them to accept all of these recommendations and implement them quickly, because this is how we get more nuclear in this country.
Yeah, and it would be nice to see like at least another 1 or 2 reactors in my lifetime.
Steady on there, Martin. That sounds a bit ambitious, but yeah, let's see how it goes.